Welcome to our Fall 2024 CISLL Fall Kickoff. We're really excited you could be here today, not least because we have a fantastic guest speaker from Northwestern University, Adriana Weisleder. But first, a few announcements about CISLL, which is the center sponsoring this event. We are the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Language and Literacy here at Northern Illinois. As far as we know, we're a pretty unique center. There aren't a lot of universities around the country that have an interdisciplinary center just for language and literacy. And you'll see that we truly are interdisciplinary. The co-directors, Allison Gladfelter and myself, I'm Lindsay Harris, are from the College of Health and Human Sciences, College of Education. We have 3 deputy directors from the Department of Psychology, the Department of Child Development and Family Sciences, and Department of World Languages and Cultures, and they each lead one of our SIGs. So if your interests are aligned with one of these topics, you might consider reaching out to the SIG director to see how to get involved in the SIG. SIG stands for Special Interest Group. We have 2 amazing graduate assistants, Megan Andrzejewski and Henry Thomaser. The special interest groups I mentioned are diversity and language processing, second language learning and bilingualism, and learning within the disciplines and across the lifespan. We try to rotate so that when we invite people to campus, they're more squarely focused on one of these SIGs or another. Dr. Weisleder, I think, is primarily under second language learning and bilingualism, but you'll see that her work is fairly broad. We, perhaps unusually, have already worked out all of the dates for our fall event. You'll see we have a number of writing retreats. These are virtual. If you are not a CISLL affiliate, go to niu.edu/CISLL, click on Become an Affiliate, fill out a couple of forms, and you're an affiliate. And then you are eligible for our POP grants, our awards, you get all of our emails about our events and everything, and you'll get invitations to our writing retreats. We have them twice a month, Tuesday mornings, Thursday afternoons. You just log in and someone holds you accountable to write for an hour. We say hello, we turn off our microphones, we write, and then we say goodbye. If you think that would be a good accountability mechanism for you, please consider joining us. We also are rolling out the first instance of our Sippin' with CISLL event. More information will be forthcoming. It's going to be an informal coffee tea hour where we can get to know each other. We tend to have what we call show and share once each semester, focused on research internal to NIU, where we invite researchers from across campus doing research somehow related to language and literacy to just give brief 10-15 minute talks about what they're working on. We are actually accepting applications for our proposal or pilot grants, what we like to call our POP grants. We have them for faculty and for students. Go to our website or look for our emails to learn more, but it's some money to support either a dissertation or thesis research project, or maybe collect some pilot data for a research study that could lead to external funding. The deadline's October 2nd. I'd like to introduce Deputy Director Mandy Freda Stutenberg to introduce our illustrious guest speaker. Thank you.
All right, hi and welcome everybody. I am delighted to introduce our Fall Kickoff keynote speaker. Dr. Adriana Weisleder joins us from the Northwestern School of Communication, where she is a faculty member in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders, and also the director of the Child Language Laboratory. Before becoming a faculty member at Northwestern, Dr. Weisleder completed her bachelor's degree in cognitive science at Northwestern, her PhD in developmental psychology at Stanford University, and a postdoctoral fellowship in primary care research at the New York University School of Medicine. I always like to mention these backgrounds because they are all so different, and then you can see sort of how faculty members arrive to their research agendas by these different avenues. Her research investigates early language development and processing among young children who are growing up in a wide range of different sociocultural backgrounds, with a focus on dual language learners. Her work uses a variety of methodologies, including eye tracking, naturalistic recordings, and studies of real-world interactions to investigate both the learning mechanisms and the different contexts that may best support language development for these learners. An important goal of her research is to contribute to building a more robust evidence base and a more robust understanding of language development in diverse contexts, with sort of an end goal of helping to reduce inequities in the identification and treatment of child language and communicative disorders. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Weisleder to the podium.
Thank you so much for having me. I have had a fantastic day already talking with a lot of you, so I am a CISLL convert. Like, yay, CISLL. And I'm excited to talk with you all and hopefully hear your questions and thoughts about this topic. So, as Mandy mentioned, my work is related in part to supporting bilingualism in a wide variety of children, but in particular today I'm going to be talking about Latine immigrant children. To start, I think, this is not a news or a surprise to anybody here, but there are changes in U.S. demographics that have been happening over the last few decades and will continue. And one way to see that is when you compare, for example, the race and ethnicity of adults in the U.S. versus children in the U.S. So we see that when we look at children in the U.S., the population of children is much more diverse than the total population or the population of adults. We are on track to be what some people call the minority-majority society in a few decades. And although we often talk about this in terms of race and ethnicity, it's also true that we are getting more diverse in terms of language backgrounds and multilingualism. So you can see in this map differences by state in the number or the proportion of children who speak a language other than English at home, what I'm going to refer to as dual language learners. And here in our great state of Illinois, we have, about a quarter of children who are speaking a language other than English at home. And of course, there are some areas in Illinois where this proportion is even larger. One thing that I'd like to say is that for a lot of immigrant children or children of immigrants, they have a natural opportunity to become multilingual, right? They have a natural opportunity to be dual language learners, to learn their home languages and to learn English. And this is something that I think we should be supporting because there are lots of benefits to multilingualism. So a lot of times we think about kind of the more concrete benefits like academic success, right? Learning to speak multiple languages can lead children to be more academically successful, but it's beyond just language and academics and literacy. Really for multilingual children, being able to maintain their home languages and to also learn English can lead to what we call adaptive success for immigrant populations, meaning that you are sort of both getting kind of acculturated to the dominant societal language, which is English, as well as maintaining your own heritage, culture, and language by becoming a multilingual. It's also associated with socio-emotional skills and development, and some have proposed even some cognitive advantages of being multilingual. So given all of these potential benefits or advantages to multilingualism, it would be nice for children who are immigrants to get the supports that they need to be able to achieve this. But this isn't always the case, and it's something that unfortunately can also be a source of pain for a lot of immigrant children and later adolescents when we realize, this has happened to many people in my own family and friend group, that over a period of time you've lost access to your home language. And even once you sort of become more aware of this and want to connect with that culture and maintain that language, it can be at a time when it's more difficult than it was, when children were younger, to relearn or sort of reconnect. So multilingualism for immigrant children can be a source of benefit and connection to culture and to family, but it can also sometimes be a source of pain when it is lost. Now, one of the things that I've realized over the course of my career and work studying this is that a lot of times we talk about bilingualism in what I call kind of like a social vacuum. Okay? And I'm going to show you an example of this. So this is a quote that I took from an article, and I'm not putting the reference because I don't want to pick at one particular article, but this is very, very kind of representative of lots of articles on bilingualism. So it says, in some areas, for example, the US, bilingualism is correlated with factors such as poverty, ethnic minority status, immigrant status, and limited proficiency in the language of schooling. Controlling for these confounding variables, balanced bilingual students who are proficient in the school language show better educational outcomes compared to monolinguals. So let's unpack this for a second. So the reason that there's a lot of articles that sound like this and say things like this is that it is important to point out that bilingualism itself, right, this is trying to make the point that bilingualism itself isn't going to cause educational or academic disadvantages, right? That in fact, bilingualism, when you control for all other factors, can provide advantages for children, right? And that's an important thing to say, and that's why I think a lot of bilingualism researchers have been focused on. On the other hand, the thing about something like this that's really hard for me is that which children exactly is this talking about, right? I mean, we know that bilingualism is in fact correlated with a lot of other characteristics of a lot of families and children. So what does it tell us if we have to control for all those other factors to see this, right? That kind of, it's sort of a little bit unsatisfying when families ask me questions, but families, my own relatives, my friends, the families that I work with, ask me questions about what bilingualism means for their child. I want to be able to give an answer that addresses their situation, right? That is directly relevant to the situation that they live in. I don't have the sort of, ability to say, well, let's control for all of these other things. So what we've been kind of trying to do is to really put bilingualism in an ecological context, right? So within its ecological context. This is a very complicated model that I'm not going to talk about all of it. You can probably barely read the words. But the idea is that multilingualism and children's social and communicative language environment, which is often what we focus on in terms of language learning and what I'm going to be focused on, occur in, it's sort of in broader social contexts that include the community context and that include political and social contexts too that affect the lives of immigrant families. And so we really need to sort of embrace some of this complexity and think about what it means to sort of grow up as a bilingual in some very specific contexts as well. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all of this today. We're not even, we're just beginning to try to connect some of these things together. But what I want to try to do today is to convince you that it's really important to try to characterize the unique learning context of dual language learners like Latine immigrant children in the U.S. And that, there's a lot of heterogeneity in bilinguals, and we need to really kind of try to deeply characterize some of these contexts for some of these groups, rather than kind of pretend that we can control for all those other variables and things will look the same way. So I'm going to really only be talking about context today. I'm not going to be talking so much about learning outcomes or mechanisms. I'm going to be focusing only on really characterizing two things. One is the patterns of dual language exposure that children from Latine immigrant families experience, and then some of their early literacy experiences. Part one, we'll be talking about patterns of dual language exposure. This is some work from Adriana Weisleder's master's thesis, as well as work with a collaborator, Dr. Meg Sikosh, who is now a professor at UCLA. In research that kind of is trying to look at early bilingual environments and bilingual language development, most of the research, the focus has been on the overall amount or proportion of exposure that children get to each of their languages and how that relates to their language development. And there's broad consensus in the field that children who hear a greater amount or proportion of input in one language have kind of faster development in that language, especially for vocabulary. I picked one example from this paper by Hoff and Ribat, And what you can see here is you can see this is Spanish-English bilingual children in Florida, and this is their English vocabulary over time from 30 to 60 months. And what you can see is all children are learning more words over time, right? Their vocabulary is growing, but that is, the kind of level of their vocabulary at each of these ages is related to how much exposure to English they have, right? So the children who have 100% exposure to English, meaning that they're English monolinguals, have at every one of these time points higher vocabularies in English than the kids who hear 75% English, 50% English, and 25% English exposure. Okay, so there's kind of this graded relationship with exposure. And the same would be true in Spanish, right? So what's missing here for the children who are bilingual is their Spanish vocabulary, which is also kind of has the same relationship to exposure. Okay. So this is kind of well known, and it's what a lot of the work has focused on. But there's a lot of variability that does not explain, right? So that's kind of amount of exposure, but there's a lot of variability in kids' language learning that does not explain. And one thing that we've started to look at recently is something that some people call the social diversity of language use, the kind of social context in which bilinguals experience or use language. So in work with adults, people have shown that there's variability in how bilingual use each language across different social contexts. Maybe you will kind of resonate or connect with these different characterizations. So one type of bilinguals is what they call integrated bilinguals, where they use both languages in different social contexts, kind of integrated, right? So that means I would use, for example, both English and Spanish at home, and English and Spanish in my work environment, and English and Spanish when I'm like walking in the street and like going around, right? That would be a kind of more integrated pattern of language use. And then there's what they call compartmentalized bilinguals, which is you really use different languages in different contexts. So for me, that's actually more accurate to how my life is, which is I use mostly Spanish at home, but I use almost only English at work, right? So that's kind of a compartmentalized. Sometimes we call children like that language brokers. They're sort of doing brokering of language for their parents, right, in different contexts. And probably those, and this is like really a continuum. It's not like you're completely only integrated or compartmentalized. So those children might be more integrated because they're having to do this translation or brokering, right? So that's one great example of a way in which you can be a more integrated bilingual. And in adults, researchers have found that those kinds of differences in how you use languages are reflected in speakers' language representations, their access, and their control, right? You need to have a lot of, different strategies for how you control two languages if they're really compartmentalized in your environment than if they're more integrated. We don't know a lot about this for kids, though, and we were wondering, so once you have children who are sort of entering school, a lot of children of immigrants in the U.S. have a compartmentalized in that they hear English at school and maybe speak their home languages at home. But we were wondering if even from a much younger age, from infancy, we could see some of these patterns as well. And so here's kind of what we were wondering about. Is language really linked to social context, even for infants? And we thought that maybe in bilingual homes, infants could still be exposed to each language in different social contexts, even within their home, with the people that they interact with at home and the kinds of activities that they do at home in different languages. This starts to relate a little bit to what I'll talk about later with literacy, for example. And if so, we thought, well, maybe they have different learning and interaction opportunities in each of their languages. For example, maybe they hear more English with siblings and other children and more Spanish with their adult caregivers. Kind of giving it away, but all right. So we looked at this in two data sets. I'm going to be focusing on the U.S. data set, which are Spanish-speaking Latine families, first-generation infants in the U.S. This is just 10 families living in an urban community, and infants were between 6 and 12 months, so really pretty young. And we actually also looked at this with our colleague, Dr. Sikosh, in a data set from Quechua speaking community in southern Bolivia, where families are bilingual in Quechua and Spanish. But I'll focus on the U.S. data set. You can ask me about the other one if you're. So how we did this is we needed to record language exposure and language use in natural environments, right? We couldn't just like bring people into the lab or the clinic and kind of mimic what happens in everyday life. So we use this technology called Lena that I've been using now for a little while, and I think some people here use as well. And it's this little audio recorder that children wear, babies wear, in a little pocket in a special vest or clothes, and they wear it for a day, like a typical day, and it records the audio environment for up to 16 hours. So we're really getting kind of a full day's picture of their life. Now, even this one day, we call them day-long recordings. I have a friend who calls them day-short recordings because one day is still not, a lot. There's a lot of different things that happen on different days of the week, etc. And we have tried to record on weekdays and weekends and other things like that. But still gives us a pretty decent idea of more of the natural language environment. So Lena has another nice feature. It uses speech technology to provide estimates of the amount of language that children hear, but it does not know what language is being spoken. So we had to do that the sort of traditional old school way by listening and annotating recordings, which is a fun task for any student. So what we did is we took these 16-hour recordings, we split them up into 30-second segments. We took out periods where the child was sleeping or where there was no speech at all, and then we classified each 30-second segment. We annotated for was there adult speech to children, adult speech to adults, child speech to children, child speech to adults, and then what language it was occurring in. Okay, so for each of these categories, was it in Spanish, in English, or mixed, meaning that both languages were being used in the same context. So after lots of coding, here is what we found. So I'm going to walk you through this. So each bar that you see here is one infant, okay, one family. So this is showing you the data for all, remember it's just 10 families. And what you see at the top here is just the speech that was being spoken by adults. It could have been any adult. It wasn't just the mom or just the dad, right? There was a variety of adults involved. And you can see the proportion of each language that's being spoken. So what you see here is the vast majority of the speech these infants heard from adults was in Spanish, right? These were Spanish-speaking, first-generation immigrant parents, and they mostly heard Spanish from adults. But then, here's what happens when we look at the speech from other children. First of all, you see not all infants are hearing speech from other children. These are siblings, but they're also other children in the community, so not necessarily siblings in all cases. And what you can see is that now there's a lot more of the yellow, so there's a lot more English, a little bit more of mixed language. And in particular, the context in which they hear the most English is when it is children talking to other children, including the infant themselves. So overall, these are infants who are still predominantly hearing Spanish. Like we would consider these infants to be predominantly exposed to Spanish, but there are some specific contexts in which they are hearing a lot more English, right? So a much higher proportion of English. Here's another way in which you can kind of see the data maybe a little bit more clearly. I wanted to show you this because you can see this is true at the level of individual infants, individual families, but here you can see it kind of aggregated. So this is the proportion of English that they're hearing. So you see from adults, almost 100% Spanish, almost no English. But then when you look at speech from other children, there's more English, and especially when it's children talking to other children in the red, right, or to the infant themselves. What does this mean? On the one hand, everybody that I talk to who sort of is a child of immigrants, this is like the most obvious thing ever. They're like, yeah, of course, I talk to my siblings in English and I talk to my parents in the home language, right? It's kind of an obvious pattern. But this is a very also particular child of immigrant pattern of first-generation immigrants. When we think about the research, for example, about bilingual infants from Canada, from places that are actually multilingual societies, we do not see or expect these kinds of patterns. This actually isn't even what the data looks like for bilingual families like in Miami, right, in the US, where there's sort of a much more bilingual community. This type of pattern, sort of social context and dual language exposure, is a particular, type of pattern that we see. So just to summarize for this particular study, we found that from a very young age, Latina infants from first-generation families hear Spanish and English in distinct interactional contexts. So we would call this starting to be kind of compartmentalized, even within the home, by different speakers and interactional contexts. And this is likely a consequence of their immigrant environment and differs from bilingual infants in other types of multilingual societies whose patterns of dual language exposure are more integrated. So of course, we don't know yet what this means exactly for children's language outcomes or for their development. That's sort of for us to see, but I think it does suggest that infants might be getting different opportunities for interaction, right? They might be exposed to different types of words, of language structures, of kind of social, communicative, and interactional contexts. And so it is important that we understand the impact of these kinds of social diversity of language use from early on and how it might differ in different multilingual environments. This might have implications for bilingual language development, and it might have implications for home language maintenance. Anile Villanueva, who was the student that led this work, she had the insight that this might be sending a sign to infants even very early on that these languages have different social meaning, right? Who do young children want to be like? Do they want to be like their parents, or do they want to be like their older siblings, right? And their other children. That's who they want to be like. So early on already, they're kind of getting the idea that English is the language that actually, like my friends and my peers and my older siblings and cousins speak. And that might be a very strong signal about what language to sort of pay attention to and want to and be motivated to learn. And it also, I think, has some implications for clinical assessments and school assessments, particularly in that a lot of times we decide what a child's dominant language is, and then we assess them in their dominant language. But if you are exposed to very different kinds of language and words in each of your languages in different contexts, what you know in each of those languages is different. So you might not, even in your dominant language, this happens to me all the time, even in your dominant language, you might not know about some kinds of vocabulary words, of sentence structures. And so it's really important that we actually always consider both languages for a bilingual child when we're doing these assessments.